The avoidant moves through the world with a finely tuned detection system, constantly scanning for threats to their autonomy, signs of excessive emotional need, or evidence that someone will eventually demand more than they can give. Most people fail this invisible test without ever knowing it existed. They pursue too eagerly, express feelings too openly, make their interests too obvious, or demonstrate need in ways that trigger the avoidant's flight response. But occasionally, the avoidant encounters someone who possesses a rare combination of qualities that doesn't just fail to trigger their defenses, it actually penetrates them. These aren't the qualities relationship advice typically promotes. They're not about being more affectionate, more communicative, or more emotionally expressive. In fact, they often look like the opposite of conventional relationship wisdom. These qualities are so rare because they require a level of emotional development, self-awareness, and counterintuitive relating that most people simply haven't cultivated. They're paradoxical, creating connection through allowing disconnection, demonstrating love through not needing it returned, and building trust through never demanding it. Understanding these qualities doesn't mean contorting yourself to appeal to avoidant attachment, but it does reveal what creates genuine safety for someone whose entire psychological system is organized around protecting themselves from the vulnerability of being truly known and truly needed. Emotional self-sufficiency that isn't performed for their benefit. The avoidant is perpetually scanning for signs that someone needs them emotionally in ways they cannot fulfill. They've learned that people's emotional needs eventually exceed their capacity to meet them, creating pressure, disappointment, and the inevitable moment when they're revealed as inadequate. But the first quality that truly captivates an avoidant is encountering someone whose emotional self-sufficiency is so genuine, so deeply rooted, that it exists completely independent of the avoidant's presence or absence. This isn't the performed independence of someone trying to appear low maintenance to attract the avoidant. The avoidant can detect that performance immediately. The person who claims to be fine, but whose energy reveals they're carefully managing their emotions to avoid seeming needy. Who says they don't need anything, but clearly hopes the avoidant will offer anyway. Who performs self-sufficiency while secretly keeping score of every time the avoidant fails to show up. This strategic independence triggers the avoidant's suspicion and confirms their belief that everyone eventually reveals their neediness given enough time. True emotional self-sufficiency looks entirely different. It's someone who has genuinely done the internal work to resource themselves emotionally, who has built a life so rich with meaning, connection, and purpose that the avoidant's participation is genuinely optional rather than necessary. This person isn't waiting for the avoidant to complete them, save them, or provide the emotional sustenance they cannot provide for themselves. They're already whole, already fulfilled, already capable of navigating their emotional landscape without requiring the avoidant to be their guide, their therapist, or their primary source of validation. What makes this quality so rare is that it requires years of internal development that most people haven't undertaken. It means having done therapy or deep personal work to heal childhood wounds rather than expecting a romantic partner to heal them. It means having cultivated friendships that meet emotional needs for connection, understanding, and support, rather than expecting one person to be everything. It means having developed practices for self-soothing, emotional regulation, and meaning-making that don't require another person's participation or validation. The avoidant experiences this quality as profoundly relieving. For perhaps the first time in their relational life, they're not carrying the weight of someone else's emotional well-being on their shoulders. They're not responsible for managing someone's anxiety about their relationship, for reassuring someone of their worth, for providing constant evidence that they still care. They can withdraw without creating a crisis. They can be unavailable without triggering abandonment panic. They can be exactly who they are, limited, defended, emotionally reserved, without feeling like they're failing someone who needs them to be more. This quality also creates safety for the avoidant because it means their worst relational fear, that their emotional limitations will destroy someone who depends on them, cannot come true. This person won't be destroyed by the avoidant's unavailability because they're not dependent on the avoidance availability. They won't fall apart during the avoidant's inevitable withdrawals because they have a sturdy internal foundation that doesn't require the avoidant's presence to remain standing. The avoidant can finally relax the hypervigilance about whether they're giving enough, showing up enough, being enough. But what truly makes this quality rare and valuable to the avoidant is that it paradoxically allows them to be more vulnerable than they can be with someone who needs them. When the avoidant knows their partner is genuinely fine without them, they can choose connection from desire rather than obligation. They can show up because they want to, not because someone will fall apart if they don't. This removes the pressure that typically triggers their withdrawal and creates space for them to explore their own capacity for intimacy without the weight of someone else's emotional survival depending on it. The emotionally self-sufficient person also doesn't make the avoidance withdrawal about themselves. When the avoidant needs space, this person doesn't spiral into, "What did I do wrong?" or "Am I not enough?" They recognize the avoidance withdrawal as the avoidance process, respect it without taking it personally, and continue living their rich, full life. This response is revolutionary for the avoidant, who is accustomed to their need for space being treated as rejection, punishment, or evidence of relational failure. For the first time, their autonomy is respected rather than pathologized. Moreover, someone with genuine emotional self-sufficiency brings a quality of groundedness and stability that the avoidant finds magnetic. This person isn't reactive, isn't desperately seeking reassurance, isn't oscillating between clinging and withdrawing. They're steady, consistent, and present without being demanding. This steadiness creates a gravitational pull for the avoidant because it offers something their nervous system has rarely encountered: the possibility of connection without chaos, intimacy without intensity, and love without the terror of being consumed by someone else's needs. The avoidant also notices that this person's self-sufficiency extends to how they handle conflict and disappointment. When the avoidant inevitably fails to meet expectations or disappoints them, the emotionally self-sufficient person processes their feelings independently rather than making the avoidant responsible for managing their emotional response. They might express disappointment clearly and directly, but they don't collapse into it, don't weaponize it, and don't require the avoidant to fix their emotional state before the relationship can continue. This emotional resilience means the avoidant doesn't have to walk on eggshells or avoid authentic expression for fear of triggering emotional devastation they'll be required to repair. Furthermore, this quality reveals itself in how the person maintains their own identity, interests, and social connections independent of the relationship. They don't slowly abandon their friendships to make the avoidant their primary source of connection. They don't give up hobbies or passions to maximize time together. They don't reshape their entire life around the avoidant's schedule or preferences. This maintenance of separate selfhood paradoxically makes the avoidant feel safer being close because closeness doesn't threaten to consume either person's individual identity. The avoidant witnesses someone who can be deeply connected while remaining fundamentally themselves, which offers a template for intimacy the avoidant never knew was possible. The capacity to love without needing love, returned in equal measure. The second rare quality that penetrates the avoidant's defenses is perhaps the most paradoxical and most difficult to embody. The capacity to genuinely love someone while being completely at peace with receiving significantly less love in return. This isn't martyrdom, it's not self-abandonment, and it's not the desperate hope that eventually the avoidant will reciprocate if given enough patient love. It's something far more psychologically sophisticated: the ability to give love freely as an expression of one's own heart, rather than as a transaction requiring equal return. Most people love conditionally, even when they believe their love is unconditional. They love with the expectation of reciprocation, with the hope that their emotional investment will be matched, with the underlying requirement that the other person demonstrate equivalent care through actions, words, or commitment. When that reciprocation doesn't materialize in the expected timeline or quantity, resentment builds, and the love begins to feel like sacrifice rather than gift. The avoidant has experienced this pattern repeatedly. Someone claims to love them, then gradually reveals that this love comes with expectations the avoidant cannot meet, leading to disappointment, conflict, and eventual ending. But the person with this rare capacity operates from an entirely different paradigm. They love because loving enriches their own experience, because this particular person evokes something in them worth feeling, because the act of loving itself is valuable regardless of what returns. They're not keeping score, not measuring whether they're giving more than they're receiving, not building a case for how much they've done while the avoidant has remained distant and defended. They love with open hands rather than grasping ones. This quality is extraordinarily rare because it requires a level of emotional abundance that most people don't possess. It comes from having healed enough that love isn't desperately needed as proof of worthiness. It comes from being so full of self-love and external sources of love that romantic love becomes an overflow rather than a primary source. It comes from spiritual or philosophical development that finds meaning in the act of loving itself rather than in being loved in return. Most people haven't done this depth of work, so their love inevitably becomes conditional, transactional, and ultimately disappointing to the avoidant. What makes this quality so powerful for the avoidant is that it removes the pressure that typically triggers their withdrawal. The avoidant is accustomed to love as demand. I love you means, now you owe me equivalent expressions of love. But when someone loves without needing equal return, the avoidant experiences love as truly optional, truly free, truly without strings. They're not being manipulated through guilt, not being pressured to reciprocate beyond their capacity, not being made to feel inadequate for their emotional limitations. The love is simply offered, available to receive or not, without consequence either way. This person also doesn't withdraw their love when the avoidant fails to reciprocate adequately. Most people's love becomes conditional the moment they feel their emotional investment isn't being matched. They pull back, create distance, or communicate hurt that makes the avoidant feel guilty and trapped. But someone with this rare capacity continues loving steadily, regardless of what comes back. They don't love less when the avoidant withdraws. They don't punish the avoidant for emotional unavailability by becoming unavailable themselves. Their love is a constant rather than a variable dependent on the avoidant's behavior. The avoidant experiences this as simultaneously confusing and deeply touching. They cannot understand loving without reciprocation requirement because it violates their entire understanding of how relationships work. But they also recognize it as perhaps the only kind of love their defended heart can safely receive. With this person, they don't have to pretend to feel more than they feel, don't have to perform emotional availability they don't possess, don't have to fake reciprocal intensity to keep someone from leaving. They can show up exactly as they are, limited, defended, capable of only modest emotional expression, and still be loved. This quality also creates space for the avoidant to explore their own capacity to love without pressure. When love isn't demanded, the avoidant sometimes discovers they have more to give than they believed. The absence of expectation paradoxically allows them to exceed what they would have offered under pressure. They might find themselves wanting to reciprocate, not because they have to, but because the freedom from having to makes genuine desire possible. The person who loves without needing equal return sometimes receives more than the person who desperately demands it. However, this quality cannot come from self-abandonment or accepting crumbs while dying of hunger. The person who embodies this must genuinely not need the avoidant's love to be okay, must have other sources of love and meaning that fulfill them, must be choosing to love the avoidant from abundance rather than scarcity. If loving without reciprocation is creating suffering, depleting them, or making them smaller, it's not the rare quality the avoidant values. It's codependency, masquerading as unconditional love, the ability to witness their vulnerability without trying to fix, save, or possess them. The third rare quality that deeply impacts the avoidant is the ability to see them in their most defended, wounded, vulnerable state and respond with simple, steady presence rather than rushing in to fix, heal, rescue, or use that vulnerability as leverage for greater intimacy. The avoidant's deepest terror is being seen in their brokenness and having that sight either repel someone or activate someone's need to repair them. But the person with this quality does neither. They simply see, accept, and remain present without agenda. Most people respond to the avoidant's rare moments of vulnerability in one of several ways that all trigger immediate defensive shutdown. Some are visibly uncomfortable with the vulnerability and subtly communicate that the avoidant should return to their composed, defended state. Some rush to fix whatever problem is being revealed, offering solutions and suggestions that communicate the vulnerability is something to be eliminated rather than honored. Some use the vulnerability as an opening to push for greater emotional intimacy than the avoidant is ready for, essentially punishing vulnerability by demanding more of it. And some respond with such intense emotional reaction, tears, excessive sympathy, dramatic concern, that the avoidant feels responsible for managing the other person's response to their pain. The person with this rare quality does something entirely different and entirely revolutionary for the avoidant. They witness the vulnerability with calm, grounded presence. They don't look away, but they also don't make it into something bigger than it is. They don't try to fix it, but they also don't ignore it. They acknowledge what they're seeing without judgment, without pity, without the need to change it or use it for their own purposes. They hold space for the avoidant's vulnerability the way one might observe a wild animal, with respect for its nature, without trying to domesticate or capture it. This quality is rare because it requires tremendous emotional maturity and self-regulation. It requires being comfortable with other people's pain without needing to make it go away. It requires trusting that the avoidant is capable of handling their own emotions without rescue. It requires having secure enough attachment that witnessing someone's wounds doesn't trigger one's own attachment anxiety or need to merge. It requires understanding that vulnerability shared is not permission granted for unlimited access to someone's inner world. What makes this response so powerful for the avoidant is that it's perhaps the only response that doesn't immediately make them regret being vulnerable. When someone witnesses without fixing, the avoidant doesn't feel pressure to explain, justify, or provide more vulnerability than they're ready for. When someone sees without trying to save, the avoidant doesn't feel infantilized or inadequate. When someone accepts without trying to possess, the avoidant doesn't feel that their moment of openness has created obligation or expectation for continued openness. This quality also communicates a profound form of respect for the avoidant's autonomy and capacity. The person who can witness without fixing is implicitly saying, "I trust you to handle your own emotional experience. I don't need to rescue you because you're not helpless. I can be present with your pain without needing to make it my responsibility to eliminate it." This trust is something the avoidant rarely receives. Most people respond to vulnerability as if the avoidant is incapable of managing their own inner world without help. The avoidant also values this quality because it allows vulnerability to be an occasional gift rather than a door that once opened must remain open. The person who witnesses without possessing doesn't use one vulnerable moment as justification for expecting constant vulnerability. They don't reference that one time the avoidant cried or shared something painful as leverage for demanding more emotional disclosure. They allow the avoidant to retreat back into their defended state without punishment, without comments about them closing off again, without making the avoidant feel that they've created expectations they cannot meet. This quality creates safety for future vulnerability in a way nothing else can. The avoidant learns through experience that showing vulnerability to this person doesn't lead to pressure for more vulnerability, doesn't create obligation, doesn't result in their wounds being used against them, or their defenses being pathologized. This safety is what allows the avoidant to occasionally lower their guard, not because they've been convinced to, not because they've worked through their issues, but because they've found someone who can see them and still let them be who they are. Moreover, the person with this quality doesn't make the avoidant's vulnerability about themselves. They don't take the avoidant's rare emotional openness as a sign of special connection that elevates their importance in the avoidant's life. They don't use the vulnerability as evidence that the avoidant really does have feelings that can be accessed with the right approach. They recognize the vulnerability for what it is: a momentary window into a complex human being who exists, whether that window is open or closed, whose worth isn't determined by their willingness to remain exposed.